Alright, for today's critical thought, we're going to be turning to kind of a somber topic, as we're going to discuss how, in today's market, it feels like the arcade-style games are no longer really viable, and what that means for indie developers in general. I was reading the PostMortem of one of the developers I follow they left on their Patreon, and I don't want to name names, so they feel like they want to identify themselves, feel free to in the comments below. But they made a quote-unquote arcade-style game, and after releasing it and the game just not doing well, they came to the conclusion that I think a lot of people have come to terms with, that the idea behind arcade games in today's market is no longer really a viable way for a developer to make a game and, of course, try to profit or live off of it. So when we talk about the idea of arcade games, we're referring to a title that has a very limited but very specific core gameplay loop. It is a title that is meant for minutes of engagement. Nowhere should it be approaching hour or hours. And typically we refer to this as a lot of first generation games that were released on the consoles, and especially during the NES and kind of into maybe the early 90s. For those of you who don't know the history, with the arcade industry kind of being the template for the console market, many early console titles were built on the same kind of arcade logic. You have a limited number of plays, you die, game over, you go back to the start, everything is wiped, do it again. Of course, that in the corner there is Contra, and I'm actually just using that footage to show off that I managed to beat the game without needing the Konami code. But for the longest time, as we've talked about, that this idea of trying to make a game and at least earn some measure of profit off of it let developers have a very wide berth in terms of their designs. From pretty much the thousands to arguably maybe the beginning of last decade, you could release almost any kind of game and at least guarantee some measure of interest and profit. Again, we're not talking about making a Pong clone and earning $10 million. But you could at least guarantee that there was at least some segment of the market that was interested in these smaller title games. But over the past decade, as we continue to talk about, the bar of what it means to make a game has grown exponentially. And I mean, in the last 2-3 years alone, look at the games that we've seen, from Disco Elysium, Celeste, Slay the Spire. We've got upcoming games like World of Horror, Hellsign, Undermine, and so many more of these titles are able to, while they may not hit the same level of production values as a AAA company, they are still doing amazing and unique things that nobody else has done before. And what that means, sadly, is that for developers who are trying to do something that's been done before, it has become a much harder sale. As our favorite expression goes, these days you really have to be safely extreme. You need your game to be unique and interesting enough that nobody else can copy it, but it also needs to be safe enough that people can represent or they can recognize it. And if you try and do either extreme, it doesn't always end up working. And this is incredibly true when it comes to the arcade-style games. And we still see these games being released. For those of you who attend our live shows every Sunday, when we do our Weird Games segment, there's a good chance that at least 5 to 10 of those games being released are going to be some arcade variant. Maybe it's a Breakout clone. Maybe it's a Contra clone, maybe it's a simple platformer, or Bomberman, or Tempest, Asteroids, Space Invaders is another big one, and so on and so forth. And the arcade-style games are really good fodder as kind of like first-time developer practice. Like, if you can do something unique and interesting with Tetris, Breakout, Pong, you name it, that usually gives you a good step forward in terms of improving your design. But notice I didn't say making that your first commercially released game. And this is the problem of what we look at with arcade-style games versus the games that are being released. As we've said, not only has the bar of quality has been raised, but so has, again, the value of games have sadly gone down. The race to a dollar kind of mentality has been something that we've been seeing some developers attempt to break with having their early access or release games aiming at $24 to $29. But when you see all these games being lumped together, it becomes very hard to try and convince somebody that there's value in your game when there's something that is similarly priced but a much higher quality. And we've seen people try and release arcade-style games at like 99 cents, $2.99, $4.99, whatever. But there's two problems with this. The first is that if you're doing this during a game sale, forget about it. Why should I spend $4.99 on your game that may be an hour long if I get somebody's major game for $5.99 or somewhere around there due to a massive sale? And then the other problem is, again, the price perception when it comes to quality. Because as we've talked about before, there's a line where if you price yourself too cheaply, people will begin to wonder what's wrong with this game. Why are you releasing this game for 99 cents? What's wrong with it? Did you not finish it? Are there major bugs? Is the gameplay loop not working? So on and so forth. And there's always that mentality of in for a penny, in for a pound. This could even be the sunk cost fallacy, or I may be confusing my terms here. But if I can spend $2.99 on your little game for a few dollars more, I could get something that is more in-depth, longer gameplay, and could even be a much higher quality version of your game. And this is where this problem has come in. Now, we could even turn to the mobile side of things, as many developers have done reasonably well with mobile arcade games, because the mobile market definitely values, quick engagements rather than, having to spend $50 for a 60-hour game. But again, you can't take a mobile game and just immediately put it over to the PC and expect it to do well. And this has kind of led to this issue as to what it means to release an arcade-style game today, and can you do anything more with it? If we look at something like Contra over there, that game is about 20 to 30 minutes if you know what you're doing, less if you can speedrun it. Would anyone spend $50 or even $10 on a game that only has 30 minutes of gameplay today? And that, my friends, is another major point that we've talked about. With the rise of being able to refund games and, the 2-hour return policy, developers have felt that burn in terms of, if I release this game that only has 20 minutes of content, guess what? A lot of people may very well just return it after they're done playing with it. And this has led to developers padding their games out and kind of hurting their overall quality. But for today's market, people expect, again, some level of quality. They don't want to be playing the umpteenth Pong clone, or Breakout, or my mind is like drawing a blank on all the classic Atari-style games, Asteroids, you name it. And we can certainly make a case for games that try to elevate along those lines. In another video on topic, we talked about the presentation when it comes to these kinds of games. Having some kind of story mode, having different elements, growing the mechanics, presenting it as more than just a kind of a blank slate design. As in, the second that game is over, everything's white, we're back to the start. And for those of you who've watched more in these Spotlight games, and we've played first-time games from some of these developers, it's very much that arcade style. That the second I turn that game off, everything I've done is gone. So again, why should I give that money when I can spend money on a game that can give me hours upon hours of entertainment? And there is certainly a case to be said about games that are aimed to be on the short side. But before we move to the next part of this video, here's my question for you. If you saw two games priced at $10, one game only having 1.5 to 2 hours of content, another at least promising 10 to 20 hours of content, would that be a factor when you're deciding which game to buy? And this is a tough question for a lot of people. Because at the end of the day, we may not have, dozens upon hours in each day to play a game, but in the same breath, we don't necessarily want to spend a lot of money and get 10 minutes of gameplay. And I know somebody will point out smaller story-driven games like Gone Home and Dear Esther, but we could even argue that that market has gotten a lot harder to break into, again, with the sheer size and scope that we're seeing from a lot of other games. But with that, we're going to take our quick Patreon supporter and sponsor Shoutout break now, and when we return, I want to talk a little bit more about what this means as an indie developer, and again, some ways that you can try and elevate your game. And now for a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. Going forward, all Patreon supporters will get early access to our videos. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. In the last part, I was discussing about why the arcade market, or what is an arcade-style game, and why it's no longer considered viable. When we describe these kinds of games, they're built on a very short, oftentimes very refined core gameplay loop, but there isn't much else beyond that. The experience is very limited, and usually content or progress is wiped, outside maybe a high score. And as we've discussed, gamers and consumers expect more these days. If they're going to give you anywhere from $1 to, who knows, $50, $60, they want a very qualitative or high quality experience. But is there a way to have both? Can you elevate an arcade style game? And if you can, what are some elements to look at? And that takes me to our footage now. This is Loyalty and Blood, Victor's Origin. This is a game that follows a very basic core gameplay loop. It's run-and-gun gameplay with kind of the ability to dash and teleport. Now, again, it's something that we have seen many times over. And outside the teleporting mechanic or the dash, we just saw that with, well, Contra in the last part. So the question is, what does this game do differently or elevating wise to make it stand out? And how they do that is by having a persistence element or a persistence wrapper around this core gameplay. So how it works is every time you complete a mission, you collect resources and materials. These materials are then used to unlock new guns, craft upgrade gems that can be slotted into your gear. You can find new armor and weapon blueprints in the world itself, and all this allows you to customize your character. Now, the missions themselves are very short. They're anywhere from a minute to maybe 5 minutes at length, at least in what we've played. So each one of those missions is a very streamlined core gameplay. But the developers elevated it by adding in more of these elements that occur outside of it. There's a story that's going on right now. That would not be in an old school arcade game. And what we're seeing here, these kinds of elements, they're not as complicated to design or implement as it is figuring out and refining your core gameplay loop. But they add more to this game. They give it more value, as we've talked about in a previous video. And this is something that you need to think about as an independent developer. How do I get as much out of my game mechanics as I reasonably can? And it's not, again, about just adding in length. An arcade experience that is just 100 levels long and that's it is still not going to be as engaging if you're still repeating the same content again and again. As we've said before about puzzle games, that the entire game is just 100 screens of puzzles with no connectivity between them, that is also going to eventually drive people to stop playing. And these are things you need to consider when you're building your game. Because if you just leave it as the core gameplay loop and nothing else, it is not going to do well, especially if we're talking about the PC or console market. Again, we have seen mobile games that are built on, again, that arcade style design work out well. But again, they have a different monetization model in terms of ads and a different audience. You cannot take those games, pour them over to the PC, and expect people to spend $3.99, $5.99, whatever. Now, even with that said, even with the praise I've given to Loyalty and Blood here, it still, unfortunately, feels limited in terms of its design. Because as we've said, even with the most refined and polished core gameplay loop, if there isn't more to the game, people are going to start to feel like the experience drags on. And this is where secondary and supplemental systems and subsystems come into play. Having unique things you can do, bonus challenges, new mechanics introduced, etc. Anything that can extend the life of your game that isn't going to kill you in terms of time and budget, you need to consider. Because again, the days where you could just simply make a Match 3 clone or copy Peggle or whatever was the hot game for PopCap are long gone. Even PopCap has ran into that kind of problem in recent years. When's the last time we heard of an amazing kind of arcade style game from them? And unfortunately, this is just kind of the nature of the beast when it comes to the rise of the game industry and the rise of game design. That as more powerful engines and practices have been introduced, it's allowed developers to do more with less. And in turn, it means that the bar has gone up. You can't just release a simple 2D platformer that you call a Mario clone and charge people $20 for it. They want more out of their games. And if you can't provide it, or if you're not able to work on that, people aren't going to give your game the time of day, even if it is only 99 cents. And to wrap things up for today, the arcade mentality of a very limited playthrough and no carryover doesn't really work anymore in today's market. And we could arguably say it hasn't worked for maybe the last 5 or 6 years as well. When you're trying to release a game that only has 20 minutes of content, and right next to your name on the store page is a Game of the Year winner with dozens of hours there, who is going to want to look at your game? And unfortunately, this is a harsh truth for a lot of developers to realize. That if you can't do something different and at a high quality, your game may not even be worth anybody's money, no matter how cheap you price it. And this is often, and again, like we've seen developers just try and take what appears to be like student projects or first-time demos and try to release them on Steam or itch or anything like that, and nobody wants to play those games. And you need to have a serious discussion now about what it is you're trying to make and what is going to bring people to your game and keep them playing. Because we have seen some developers do, and I know if they haven't commented on this yet, they're going to do it after this video, about titles such as the ones from Loco Malito, who's made some really great arcade-style games with Super Hydora, Curse Castalia, and there's of course Joy Masher as well. And the reason why those games still work out reasonably well come down to both the production value in terms of music and kind of the pixel art, as well as, again, not being priced over, what their design could be. Like, to me, and I want to get your thoughts on this in the comments below, that if you're going to do an arcade style game, again, elevate Contra, elevate Streets of Rage, anything like that, I think $10 to $14 may be like kind of the high end for that kind of game. And I'm curious, like speaking about Locomolito, I'm curious to see what they will do going forward in terms of releasing their games. They've released like free versions of their titles and kind of samples as well in the past, but they've also gone like the big budget release, or quote unquote big budgets. And I'm curious to see what their next game is going to look like. But with that said, thank you so much for watching today's video. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, take care. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below, where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.